He thought the badge gave him the right to decide who belonged, until he met someone who didn't need permission to be there. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the crowded downtown street. Sirens faint in the distance, the hum of traffic blending with the restless energy of people moving through their day. And right in the middle of it all stood Naomi Carter, calm, composed, her dark eyes scanning the scene with a quiet precision that didn't match the tension building around her. She wasn't dressed to impress, just a simple navy blazer, tailored slacks. Nothing that screamed authority, nothing that demanded attention, and yet something about her presence felt anchored, like she knew something no one else did, like she was waiting. And then there was Officer Daniel Brooks, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, his posture loud with confidence, the kind of man who had spent years believing the streets answered to him. He stepped closer, voice cutting through the noise. "I said move back. You're interfering." His tone wasn't just firm. It carried that edge, that unspoken assumption, that she didn't belong in his space, that she needed to be told where her place was. And when she didn't immediately respond, when she didn't shrink or apologize or step away like he expected, something in his expression tightened, impatience creeping in, the crowd nearby beginning to notice. Phones slowly lifting, whispers spreading like a ripple across water. Imagine standing there, every eye on you, judgment hanging in the air, waiting to see how you react. Naomi didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't even step back right away. She simply looked at him, steady, unshaken, as if his authority stopped just short of reaching her. And that's what unsettled him, not defiance, not resistance, but the absence of fear, the kind of silence that doesn't submit. It observes, it calculates, it waits. "You heard me." Daniel pressed, taking another step forward, his hand gesturing sharply as if drawing an invisible line she wasn't supposed to cross. And then, with a firm motion, he pushed her back just enough to make a point, just enough for the crowd to react. A few gasps, a few murmurs, cameras tilting to capture the moment. But Naomi didn't stumble far. She regained her balance almost instantly, her expression unchanged, her breathing even. And for a brief second, something shifted in the air, something subtle, almost imperceptible, like the moment before a storm breaks. She adjusted her sleeve slowly, deliberately, eyes still locked on his. And if you were paying close enough attention, you'd notice it wasn't anger behind that gaze. It was timing. And somewhere across the street, parked just out of focus, a dark SUV sat idling, engine low, unseen by most, but not by her, because this moment, this exact moment, wasn't chaos. It wasn't random. It was part of something already in motion, something Daniel hadn't even begun to understand. And as he opened his mouth to speak again, confident, certain, completely unaware, Naomi finally moved. Just a slight shift forward, just enough to close the distance he thought he controlled. And in a voice calm enough to cut through everything, she said, "Are you sure you want to keep going?" Daniel let out a short laugh, the kind that came from someone who had never been seriously challenged, his head tilting slightly as if he had just heard something amusing rather than a warning. "Am I sure?" he repeated, his voice louder now, feeding off the attention gathering around them, the circle of onlookers tightening, phones raised higher, the quiet buzz of curiosity turning into something heavier, something expectant. He took a step closer again, closing the gap she had just shortened, his confidence swelling in the silence she offered. "You are standing in an active situation, and I have told you twice to step back," he said, each word measured, deliberate, as if the repetition itself made him more right, more justified. But Naomi did not move, not this time, her posture steady, shoulders relaxed, her gaze unwavering in a way that did not challenge him directly, but did not yield either. And that tension, that invisible line between them, began to stretch thinner and thinner, ready to snap. Imagine being in that moment, when everything around you slows down, when every small sound becomes sharp, the shuffle of shoes on concrete, the faint click of a phone camera focusing, the distant hum of an engine idling somewhere behind the scene. Naomi heard all of it, registered all of it, but none of it pulled her attention away from the man standing in front of her, because she had seen this before, not him specifically, but this pattern, this assumption, this belief that authority meant control without question. Her voice when she spoke again was softer, almost quieter than before, but somehow it carried further, cutting through the surrounding noise with ease. "You might want to think carefully about your next move," she said, not as a threat, not as a challenge, but as a statement, simple, grounded, and for the first time, something flickered in Daniel's expression, not doubt, not yet, but a brief hesitation, the kind that appears and disappears so quickly most people would miss it. But it was there, buried beneath the surface of his certainty, and instead of stepping back, instead of pausing to consider why she remained so composed, he pushed forward verbally, leaning into the authority he believed could not be questioned. "No, what I think is that you are refusing a direct order," he said, his tone sharpening, turning colder, more rigid, as if drawing lines in stone, and a few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift, sensing that something about this interaction did not feel ordinary, because there was no escalation from her side, no argument, no raised voice, just that same stillness, that same quiet control. And then she did something small, almost unnoticeable. She glanced past him for just a fraction of a second, not long enough to break the moment, but long enough to confirm something. And when her eyes returned to his, there was a change, subtle but undeniable, as if whatever she had been waiting for had just arrived. Across the street, the dark SUV's engine lowered to a near silent hum. The door still closed, but the presence inside it now active, attentive, and Daniel, completely unaware, continued speaking, his words filling the space where silence should have warned him. "Last chance," he said firmly. "Step back now." But Naomi did not step back. Instead, she took one small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to shift the balance he thought he held. And in that single movement, the energy of the entire scene changed. The crowd fell quieter, the air heavier, and she looked at him, not as someone being confronted, but as someone who had already reached the end of a decision he did not realize he had made. And with that same calm voice, steady and precise, she said, "You already made yours." For a moment, it looked like nothing had changed, like the street would simply swallow the tension and move on, like every other moment where authority spoke and everyone else listened. But then something subtle shifted, not in Naomi. She had already settled into stillness, but in the space around them. The kind of shift you do not notice until it is too late to ignore. Daniel felt it before he understood it. A slight tightening in his chest, a faint awareness that the eyes on him were no longer just curious. They were watching differently now, waiting, and still he pressed forward, because stepping back was never part of his pattern. "Then you are leaving me no choice," he said, his voice firm, but no longer as effortless as it had been seconds ago. And that was the moment the first door of the black SUV opened across the street, quiet, precise, almost surgical in its timing. A man stepped out, then another, both dressed in dark suits that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway, their movements calm, controlled, purposeful, and the energy of the crowd shifted again, whispers spreading faster now, people turning their heads, cameras adjusting angles, sensing something bigger unfolding. Naomi did not turn toward them. She did not need to. Her eyes remained locked on Daniel, who had not yet noticed, too focused on maintaining the authority he believed was still his. "You are interfering with police work," he continued, but the words landed differently now. Thinner, less grounded, because behind him, the presence approaching was impossible to ignore for long. And then he heard it. Not a shout, not a command, just a voice, low, steady, carrying the weight of someone used to being heard the first time. "Officer Brooks." The name stopped him mid-sentence, not because of the tone, but because of the certainty in it, the kind of certainty that does not guess. It knows. He turned, slowly, the confidence in his posture tightening as he saw them up close now, badges briefly visible, expressions unreadable, and in that split second, the situation he thought he controlled began to slip. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough for doubt to finally find its way in. Naomi watched it happen, the realization forming behind his eyes, the calculation starting. Too late. Always too late. She took a small breath, not relief, not tension, just timing aligning exactly as it was meant to. And then, for the first time since it began, she reached into her pocket, slowly, deliberately, every movement clear, visible, undeniable. The crowd leaned in without realizing it, the silence deepening, stretching, holding everything in place. Daniel's attention snapped back to her, his earlier certainty replaced with something sharper, something uncertain, his voice lower now, more controlled. "What is this?" he asked. But it was no longer a question of authority. It was a question of understanding. And Naomi finally broke the stillness she had carried since the beginning, her hand emerging with a badge, not flashed, not forced, just held, steady, between them, her voice calm, unwavering, carrying across the quiet street with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. "This is where you stop," she said, and the weight of those words did not come from volume, but from truth, the kind that does not need to prove itself. It simply reveals. And in that moment, everything shifted, not loudly, not violently, but completely, because the man who thought he was enforcing the rules had just stepped into something far beyond them, and he was only beginning to understand what that meant. The badge did not shine because of the light. It carried weight because of what it represented, and for a moment Daniel did not move, his eyes fixed on it, trying to process what he was seeing, trying to align it with everything he had already decided about her, and failing. The street around them seemed to hold its breath, the quiet stretching longer than it should, longer than he was comfortable with. "FBI," one of the suited agents behind him said calmly, not as an introduction, but as confirmation, and that single word landed heavier than anything that had been said before. Daniel straightened slightly, instinctively adjusting his posture, his shoulders tightening as the situation began to rearrange itself in his mind, authority shifting, control slipping. But pride does not disappear in a second. It resists. It looks for something to hold on to. "If you are federal," he said carefully, his voice lower now, measured, "then you should have identified yourself earlier." It sounded reasonable. It sounded structured. But beneath it was something else, an attempt to regain footing, to rewrite the last few minutes into something he could still stand on. Naomi did not react immediately. She let the words settle, let the silence answer. First, because sometimes the absence of response reveals more than any argument ever could. Then she took a single step closer, not to intimidate, not to challenge, but to make sure he heard every word without distraction. "I was observing," she said, her tone steady, her eyes unwavering. "And you made your decisions without needing to know who I was." The simplicity of it cut deeper than any accusation, because it was not framed as blame, it was framed as fact. And facts do not argue, they remain. The agent to Daniel's left shifted slightly, not aggressively, just enough to signal presence, enough to make it clear that this was no longer a one-sided interaction. The crowd sensed it too, the energy changing from curiosity to realization, the kind that spreads quickly when people understand they are witnessing something important, something that does not happen every day. Daniel's gaze flickered briefly toward the agents, then back to Naomi, recalculating, reassessing. The confidence he carried at the beginning now replaced with caution. "What exactly is going on here?" he asked, and this time it was not a command. It was a genuine question. Naomi lowered the badge slightly, but did not put it away, keeping it visible, not as a threat, but as clarity. "An internal review," she said, each word precise, controlled, "of conduct within this region." The meaning settled in slowly, like weight being added piece by piece, until it became impossible to ignore. Daniel's jaw tightened, the realization forming not just about the moment, but about everything that led to it, every word, every assumption, every action now being re-examined under a different light, and somewhere in that realization was the understanding that this was not about a single interaction. It was about a pattern, one that had just been seen clearly. Naomi watched him carefully, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with the calm of someone who had already reached the conclusion long before the moment arrived. "You were not wrong to act," she continued, her voice even, "but you were wrong in how you chose to act." The distinction mattered, and it landed exactly where it needed to, because it removed excuse without removing accountability. The agents remained still, the crowd silent, and for the first time since it began, Daniel did not have an immediate response. The space he once filled with certainty now occupied by something else entirely, something quieter, heavier, and far more difficult to navigate, because this was no longer about control, it was about consequence. And Naomi had not raised her voice once to make that clear. The words settled into the space between them like something that could not be taken back, and for the first time since the encounter began, Daniel did not rush to fill the silence. He stood there, shoulders squared but no longer rigid with certainty, his mind catching up to the reality unfolding in front of him. The crowd no longer just spectators, but witnesses, every glance now carrying a different kind of weight, the kind that does not fade easily. One of the agents stepped slightly closer, not to interrupt, but to reinforce what had already become clear. This was no longer a street-level interaction. It had moved beyond that the moment Naomi chose not to respond the way he expected. "Officer Brooks," the agent said calmly, his tone respectful but firm, "we are going to need you to step aside for a moment." There was no urgency in the request, no raised voice, but there was something else, something final, the kind of tone that does not invite negotiation. Daniel hesitated, not out of defiance this time, but out of the realization that every decision now carried more consequence than he had anticipated. He glanced briefly at the people around him, at the phone still raised, at the expressions that had shifted from curiosity to quiet judgment, and then back at Naomi, who remained exactly as she had been, composed, steady, her presence unchanged by the shift in control. Imagine being in that position, when everything you believed about a moment begins to unravel, when the authority you relied on no longer feels absolute, when the silence around you says more than any words could. Slowly, Daniel took a step back, just one, but it was enough. Enough to signal that something had changed, enough to acknowledge, even without saying it, that the line he thought he controlled had moved. The agent nodded slightly, acknowledging the shift, while Naomi finally lowered her badge, not out of dismissal, but because it had already done its work. "This is not about one moment," she said, her voice even, carrying just enough for him to hear clearly. "It is about patterns, decisions, and how those decisions affect the people you are sworn to serve." There was no anger in her tone, no accusation sharpened for effect, just clarity, and that clarity settled heavier than any confrontation could have. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing just slightly, replaced by something more grounded, more aware. He nodded once, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but real, and in that moment, the dynamic between them shifted completely, not into conflict, not into resolution, but into understanding, the kind that comes too late to change what already happened, but just in time to change what comes next. The agents remained present, watchful but calm, the crowd beginning to lower their phones, the energy of the moment softening as the peak passed, but the impact lingering. Naomi took a step back now, creating space, not to retreat, but to restore balance, to return the moment to something neutral, something stable. "You still have a choice in how you move forward," she added, her gaze steady. "That is the part that matters now." And for the first time since the encounter began, Daniel did not respond with authority or defense or assumption. He simply listened, because the moment had already taught him something he could not ignore. And the weight of that lesson was not in what had been said, but in how clearly it had been revealed. The street slowly began to breathe again, but not in the same way it had before. Something had shifted beneath the surface, something that would not simply fade with time, the kind of moment people would replay later, not because of what was loud, but because of what was revealed in the quiet. Daniel stood there for a second longer, feeling the weight of eyes that no longer saw him the same way, not as the unquestioned authority he had carried into the situation, but as someone who had just been seen, clearly, without the shield he thought was enough. And that realization settled deeper than any confrontation could have. He adjusted his stance, not out of confidence, but out of awareness, the kind that forces you to look inward even when you would rather look away. The agents had stepped back slightly now, giving space, not because the moment was over, but because it had already reached its turning point. Naomi watched carefully, not judging, not pressing, simply observing the aftermath of a choice that had already played out. "You said this is about patterns," Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter, stripped of the sharp edge it carried before, and there was something different in it now. Not submission, not defeat, but recognition, the beginning of understanding. Naomi nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Patterns do not start in moments like this," she said, her tone steady. "They are built over time, reinforced by what we allow ourselves to believe without questioning. The words landed with precision, not to accuse, but to illuminate. Daniel looked down briefly, then back up, as if searching for something to hold on to, something to make sense of it all. And this, he gestured lightly around them. The crowd, the agents, the space that had turned into something far bigger than he expected. This is part of that. It was not a question, it was an acceptance, and Naomi did not rush to respond. She let him sit in that realization. Because some answers are not meant to be given immediately, they are meant to be understood, piece by piece. The noise of the city began to return in fragments. Distant engines, footsteps, quiet. Conversations picking back up, but the core of the moment remained intact, like a mark that would not be easily erased. What happens next? Daniel asked after a pause. And this time, there was no attempt to control the answer, no expectation of how it should go, just a genuine uncertainty. Naomi took a small breath, considering not just the procedure, but the person standing in front of her. There will be a review, she said, calm and direct, not just of today, but of everything connected to it. She held his gaze, making sure the meaning was clear without needing to emphasize it. But what matters more is what you take from this before anyone writes a report. The distinction mattered, because it shifted the focus from consequence to choice, from reaction to reflection. Daniel absorbed that. The silence between them no longer tense, but heavy with thought. The kind that lingers long after the moment ends. He nodded again, more firmly this time, not because he had all the answers, but because he understood that the answers would not come from outside. They would come from what he chose to confront within himself. Naomi stepped back once more, signaling that the direct exchange had reached its natural end. The agents began to move with quiet efficiency, not dramatic, not rushed, just steady, controlled, restoring order without spectacle. And as the crowd slowly dispersed, the energy of the street returning to something familiar, one thing remained different, something invisible but undeniable, because in that brief intersection of power and truth, a line had been redrawn, not by force, not by volume, but by clarity, and the kind of clarity that, once seen, cannot be unseen. The last of the onlookers drifted away slowly, but not without turning back at least once, as if trying to hold on to the moment just a little longer, because something about it felt unfinished, not unresolved, but incomplete in a way that lingered. Daniel remained where he was, no longer at the center of attention, but not yet free from the weight of it either. His eyes followed the subtle movements of the agents as they coordinated quietly, exchanging brief words, taking note of details that had seemed invisible just minutes ago. And for the first time, he saw the scene not as something he controlled, but as something he had stepped into without fully understanding. Naomi stood a few feet away now, her posture relaxed, but her awareness unchanged, as if the moment had not ended for her, only shifted into its next phase. Imagine realizing that what felt like a single decision was actually part of something much larger, something already in motion long before you arrived. Daniel exhaled. Slowly, the tension in his shoulders releasing just enough to let clarity take its place. How long? He asked, his voice measured, careful, not out of fear, but out of the recognition that the answer mattered more than the question itself. Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the conversation still existed between them. Long enough, she said, her tone even, to understand what needed to be seen. There was no exaggeration in her words, no attempt to dramatize what had already spoken for itself, and that simplicity carried more weight than anything else. Daniel nodded faintly, absorbing it, the idea that this was not about him alone, but about something broader, something systemic, and yet, at the same time, deeply personal, because it was his decisions, his actions, his assumptions that had been part of what was observed. He looked around again, but this time, not at the crowd, not at the agents, but at the space itself, the street, the sidewalks, the everyday environment he had moved through countless times without questioning it. And now, it felt different, not physically, but in what it represented. Naomi stepped closer again, but not into his space, just near enough for her voice to carry without effort. "You will have a chance to explain," she said, calm and direct. "But explanations are only as strong as the awareness behind them." The words were not a warning. They were a reality, and Daniel understood that. Not instantly, not completely, but enough to know that this was not something he could approach the same way he had approached everything before. One of the agents approached Naomi briefly, speaking in a low tone, and she nodded once, acknowledging whatever had been confirmed, then turned her attention back to Daniel for a final moment, not to extend the conversation, but to close it with clarity. What you do next will matter more than what already happened, she said, her gaze steady, unwavering, and there was no room to misunderstand it, because the past was fixed, but the future, the next decision, the next action, that was still open, still unwritten. Daniel met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no resistance in it, no attempt to assert control, only a quiet understanding that something had changed, not around him, but within him, and that change, though subtle, would follow him long after the street returned to normal. Naomi stepped back, the agents moving with her now, their presence receding without spectacle, without noise, leaving behind a space that looked exactly as it had before, but felt entirely different. Because sometimes, the loudest shift does not come from what is said or done, but from what is finally understood. And as Daniel stood there, no longer at the center, but still at the point where everything had shifted, he realized something that could not be undone. That power is not proven in the moment you assert it, but in the moment you are forced to question it. The street returned to its rhythm, but Daniel did not move with it. He stood there as if time had slowed just for him, the echoes of everything that had just unfolded still settling into place. People walked past again, conversations resumed, traffic flowed, but none of it felt the same, not from where he stood, because once you see something clearly, you cannot go back to how it looked before. And that clarity followed him like a shadow he could not step away from. He looked down at his hands for a brief second, then back up at the street ahead, the same street he had patrolled for years, the same corners, the same sidewalks, the same faces, but now there was a question in his mind that had not been there before, not loud, not overwhelming, just persistent. Imagine realizing that what you believed was certainty was actually assumption, and that assumption had guided more than just one moment. It had shaped patterns you never stopped to examine. Daniel took a slow breath, deeper than before, as if grounding himself in something new, something unfamiliar. Across the street, the dark SUVs had already begun to pull away, their presence fading without spectacle, just as quietly as they had arrived. Naomi stood near the curb for a moment longer, speaking briefly with one of the agents, her expression unchanged, composed, steady, as if this was simply another step in a process that extended far beyond what anyone else had seen. She glanced once more in Daniel's direction, not to check on him, not to judge him, but to acknowledge the moment had reached its conclusion, and then she turned, stepping into the vehicle without hesitation, the door closing with a soft finality that carried more weight than any dramatic exit ever could. Daniel watched as the SUVs disappeared into traffic, the last visible trace of the shift that had taken place. And yet, even as they vanished, the impact remained, not in the street, not in the crowd, but in him. One of his fellow officers approached slowly from behind, hesitant, unsure how to enter a moment that had clearly changed shape. "You good?" the officer asked, the question simple, but loaded with everything that had just happened. Daniel did not answer immediately, not because he did not hear it, but because the answer was no longer simple. He nodded once after a pause, a small gesture, not entirely convincing, but honest in its own way. "Yeah," he said quietly, though his tone carried something different now, not the confidence he had earlier, but a kind of reflection that had not been there before. The officer lingered for a second, then gave a brief nod and stepped away, sensing that whatever Daniel was processing was something he needed to face alone. And that was the truth of it, because moments like this do not end when the scene clears. They continue in the silence that follows, in the thoughts that return when everything else quiets down. Daniel adjusted his uniform slightly, not out of habit this time, but as if reconnecting with something he needed to understand differently. He looked down the street one more time, then in the direction Naomi had gone, and in that quiet space between past action and future choice, something settled into place. Not an answer, not a resolution, but a realization. That authority is not defined by how quickly you act, but by how deeply you understand the impact of that action. And as he finally turned to walk away, back into the flow of the city, he carried that realization with him, not as a burden, but as something that would shape every step he took from that point forward. The rest of the shift moved forward, but not in the way it used to. Every call that came through the radio, every passing glance, every interaction carried a subtle difference that only Daniel could feel, like the world had not changed at all, but his place inside it had shifted just enough to make everything look unfamiliar. The patrol car idled for a moment longer than usual before he stepped in, his hand resting briefly on the door as if he needed that extra second to collect something he could not quite name. Imagine going back to the same routine, the same streets, the same responsibilities, but realizing that the lens you see them through is no longer the same. That is where he was now, not at the beginning of something, but somewhere in the middle of a realization that had no clear end. He sat behind the wheel, the familiar layout of the dashboard grounding him in something steady, but even that felt different, not wrong, just incomplete without the awareness that had settled in earlier. The radio crackled with a routine dispatch, nothing urgent, nothing unusual, and yet he listened more carefully than before, not just to the words, but to what they implied, to the context he might have overlooked before, because now he knew that what you miss matters just as much as what you see. His partner glanced over at him briefly, noticing the silence, noticing the change, but choosing not to interrupt it, because some shifts do not need to be spoken to be understood. Daniel adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, eyes scanning the street ahead, but this time, not with the same assumptions he carried before. This time, there was a pause behind every observation, a question that followed every conclusion, and that pause, that question, was new. Later, as the car slowed near a busy intersection, a pedestrian hesitated at the curb, unsure whether to cross. Daniel noticed it immediately, not just the hesitation, but the reason behind it, the uncertainty, the calculation, the silent question of whether it was safe, whether it was welcome, and for the first time, he saw that moment from the other side. Not as control, but as perception. He eased the car forward slightly, then stopped completely, giving a clear, unmistakable signal. The pedestrian looked up, surprised at first, then nodded slightly and crossed. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it carried more meaning than it should have, because it was not about the action itself, it was about the awareness behind it. Daniel watched until the person reached the other side safely, then continued driving, the street unfolding ahead just as it always had, but no longer feeling the same, because something fundamental had shifted, not in policy, not in protocol, but in perspective, and that shift could not be undone, not because it was forced, but because it was understood. And as the city moved around him, unchanged on the surface, Daniel carried forward with something quieter, something less visible, but far more powerful, the beginning of a different way of seeing, a different way of acting, one decision at a time, not to prove anything to anyone else, but because once you recognize the weight of your choices, you can never pretend they are light again. The hours passed, but the shift did not blur the way it usually did. Every moment felt more defined, more deliberate, as if time itself had slowed just enough for Daniel to notice what he had once overlooked. The routine calls came and went, nothing extraordinary, nothing that would have stood out on any other day, but today was different, because he was different. Imagine realizing that change does not arrive all at once, it settles in quietly, in the way you pause before speaking, in the way you observe before acting, in the way you question what once felt automatic. That was where Daniel found himself now, not transformed, not perfect, but aware, and that awareness followed him into every interaction. Later in the evening, as the sun dipped lower and the city lights began to take over, the patrol car slowed near a small convenience store, a place he had passed countless times without a second thought. But tonight, something caught his attention, not urgency, not danger, just a subtle tension in the way two individuals stood near the entrance, their posture guarded, their movements cautious. He watched for a moment, not rushing in, not assuming, just observing, because now he understood that what you see on the surface is only part of the story. He stepped out of the car, his presence calm, measured, not announcing itself with authority, but with intention. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his voice steady, open, and the difference was immediate, not in what he said, but in how he said it. One of the individuals looked at him, hesitant at first, then responded, explaining the situation, something simple, something that did not require escalation, just clarity, just patience. Daniel listened, really listened, not preparing his response while they spoke, but taking in every word, every detail, allowing the moment to unfold without forcing it into a conclusion he had already decided. And within minutes, the tension eased, the situation resolved without pressure, without assumption, just understanding. He nodded once, acknowledging them, then stepped back, returning to the car with a quiet sense of something shifting further into place. His partner glanced at him again, this time with a slight nod, a silent recognition that something had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that needed explanation, but in a way that was clear enough to be felt. The city moved on around them, as it always did, unaware of the internal shift taking place within one individual among thousands. But that was the nature of it. Real change does not always announce itself. It does not need an audience. It happens in the decisions no one sees, in the moments that pass without conflict because someone chose to approach them differently. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel again, looking out at the street ahead, and for the first time since the beginning of the day, there was a sense of direction that did not come from control, but from understanding, not from authority, but from awareness. And as the patrol car pulled back into motion, blending into the flow of the city once more, he carried that awareness with him, not as a reminder of what went wrong, but as a guide for what could be done right. Because the most powerful shift is not in what happens to you, but in what you choose to do after you finally see clearly. The night settled over the city in layers, streetlights casting long reflections across the pavement, the hum of engines blending into a steady rhythm that never truly stopped. And inside the patrol car, Daniel sat quieter than usual, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was more to think about than words could easily carry. Every mile they drove felt like a continuation of something that had started hours earlier, something that had not ended when the street cleared or when the SUVs disappeared. Imagine carrying a moment with you, not as a memory that fades, but as a lens that sharpens everything you see after it. That was what this had become, not an event, but a perspective. They slowed near another intersection, the traffic light shifting from red to green, and for a brief second, everything paused again, not externally, but internally, Daniel's thoughts aligning with the rhythm of the city. He glanced at his reflection in the side mirror, just for a moment, not out of habit, but out of recognition, seeing not just the uniform, not just the role, but the person inside it, and the responsibility that came with both. His partner finally spoke, breaking the silence in a way that felt natural, not intrusive. You handled that situation earlier differently, he said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what was obvious. Daniel nodded slightly. I still forward. Yeah, he replied, simple, but carrying more meaning than the word alone suggested. His partner leaned back a bit, considering it, then added, different is not bad, and left it at that, because sometimes the most important acknowledgments do not need explanation. Daniel let that settle, not as validation, but as confirmation that the shift was not just internal. It was visible, subtle, but real. Another call came through, routine, a minor report that required presence but not urgency. They responded without hesitation, pulling up to a quiet residential street lined with small houses and dim porch lights. The kind of place where everything looked calm on the surface, but still required attention. Daniel stepped out of the car, the cool night air grounding him again, reminding him that every situation, no matter how simple it seemed, deserved clarity. He approached the front yard where a man stood waiting, his posture tense, but not aggressive, just uncertain, and instead of assuming, instead of stepping in with conclusions already formed, Daniel paused, just briefly, enough to let the moment present itself. Tell me what is going on, he said, his tone steady, open, and the difference was immediate. The man exhaled, as if the space to speak had just been created, explaining the situation clearly, without resistance, without hesitation. And as Daniel listened, really listened, he realized something that had not been as clear before. That control does not come from asserting authority first. It comes from understanding first. The conversation moved smoothly, resolution coming without pressure, without escalation, just clarity meeting clarity. And when it was done, when the situation settled back into calm, Daniel stepped away with a quiet awareness that this was not coincidence. This was choice, repeated, intentional. And as he returned to the patrol car, the night stretching ahead with more miles, more calls, more moments waiting to unfold, he understood that what happened earlier was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a different way forward, not perfect, not complete, but real. And as the car pulled away, blending back into the steady flow of the city, one thought remained clear above all else, that the true measure of authority is not in how quickly it is used, but in how carefully it is understood. By the time the night stretched toward its final hours, the city had quieted just enough to reveal the spaces between the noise, the empty streets, the distant glow of traffic lights changing for no one, the subtle rhythm of a place that never truly sleeps but still finds moments to breathe. And inside that rhythm, Daniel felt something settle, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the kind of weight that comes from repeated choices made differently. The patrol car rolled through a near empty avenue, headlights tracing long lines across the asphalt. And for a moment, there were no calls, no voices on the radio, just the hum of the engine and the quiet presence of thought. Imagine reaching a point where the lesson is no longer something you are trying to understand, but something you are beginning to live. That was where he stood now, not at the end, but past the point of denial, past the point of resistance. Somewhere deeper, where awareness turns into responsibility. His partner leaned back, glancing out the window, then over at him, as if measuring the silence differently now. Long shift, he said casually, not expecting much of a response. Daniel nodded once, but this time, there was a slight shift in his expression, not exhaustion, but clarity. Yeah, he replied, and the word carried something steadier than before, something grounded. They continued down the road until they reached a familiar block, one Daniel had driven through countless times without noticing anything beyond what was necessary. But tonight, he slowed just slightly, his eyes moving more deliberately, not searching for problems, but acknowledging presence, the people, the spaces, the quiet interactions that made up the environment he was part of, not above, not separate. But within, a porch light flickered on as someone stepped outside, pausing for a moment to look at the passing patrol car, not with fear, not with tension, just awareness. And Daniel noticed it, not as a detail to dismiss, but as something to understand, because every glance, every reaction, carried meaning shaped by experience, shaped by patterns, and patterns could change, slowly, but only if someone chose to change them. The realization was not overwhelming. It was steady, like a current. Beneath the surface, guiding rather than forcing. The radio remained quiet, the night holding its calm, and in that calm, Daniel allowed himself a moment to reflect without distraction, not on what he had done wrong, but on what he could do right moving forward. The distinction mattered, because it shifted the focus from regret to intention, from looking back to moving forward. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel again. But this time, it felt different, not like holding control, but like holding responsibility, something more balanced, something more aware. They reached the end of the block and paused at a stop sign, the red light casting a soft glow across the dashboard. And for a brief second, everything aligned, the quiet street, the steady breath, the clarity of thought. And in that moment, Daniel understood something that would stay with him long after the shift ended. That authority is not something you prove in front of others. It is something you practice when no one is watching, in the small decisions, in the quiet moments, in the choice to see people not as problems to manage, but as individuals to understand. The light turned, the car moved forward, and the night continued, unchanged on the surface, but for him, entirely different, because the most powerful shift had already happened, not in what the world expected from him, but in what he now expected from himself. The first hint of morning began to press against the edges of the city, a soft gray light replacing the deep tones of night, and with it came a quiet sense of closure, not loud, not final, but steady, like the last note of a song that lingers just long enough to be felt. The patrol car moved through the nearly empty streets, the world slower now, as if everything was taking a breath before starting again. And inside that stillness, Daniel felt something settle into place, Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to know that what had shifted would not return to what it was before. Imagine reaching the end of a long day and realizing that the most important part of it was not what you did, but what you understood. That was where he stood now, not defined by the moment that started it, but shaped by everything that followed. They pulled into the station lot, the tires rolling gently over the pavement as the engine idled down. The routine of ending a shift beginning to take over, familiar, automatic. But even that felt different now. Daniel stepped out of the car, the early morning air cool against his skin, grounding him in the present, reminding him that every shift ends, but not every lesson does. He paused for a moment beside the vehicle, looking out toward the street. Beyond the station, the same streets he would return to, the same responsibilities waiting for him again, but with a different understanding of what they meant. His partner closed the door on the other side and gave him a brief nod, not saying anything, not needing to, because some things had already been understood without words. Daniel nodded back, a small acknowledgement, and began walking toward the entrance, each step steady, not rushed, not hesitant, just intentional. Inside, the station was quiet, the low hum of early shift activity beginning to rise, officers moving in and out, conversations starting, reports being filed, the rhythm continuing as it always did. But for Daniel, there was a subtle difference, not in what he saw, but in how he saw it. The faces, the voices, the environment, all part of something larger than individual moments, something shaped by countless decisions, big and small, visible and unseen. He reached the desk, setting down his notes, the paperwork. Simple, routine, but now carrying a different weight. Not just documentation, but reflection, a record of what happened, and a reminder of what it meant. He completed it carefully, not rushing through, not treating it as something to finish quickly, but as something to understand fully, because even in the smallest tasks, intention mattered. And when he finally stepped away, the shift officially over, there was no sense of relief in the usual way, no feeling of being done. Instead, there was a quiet awareness that something had begun, something that would continue beyond this day, beyond this moment, beyond any single interaction. He walked back outside, the morning light now stronger, the city beginning to wake, people stepping into their day, unaware of the shift that had taken place within one person among many. And that was the truth of it. Real change does not announce itself. It does not ask to be seen. It simply moves forward, one choice at a time, one moment at a time, shaping everything that comes after. And as Daniel stood there for a brief second before heading home, one thought remained clear, steady, undeniable, that he once believed he understood what it meant to carry authority, but now, for the first time, he understood what it meant to carry responsibility, and that difference would follow him into every step he took from that day on, because the badge he wore had not changed, but the man behind it finally had.